Hey everyone, welcome to our final lecture of the season already. I don't know how that happens. I wrote the date down today, 4/4/2018. I have no idea what happened the other 3 months. So, Rahul Sahni, who received his Master of Architecture from Rice Architecture in 1971, and is now president of Llewelyn, Davies, Sahni, and also a member of the school's advisory board, established the Llewelyn, Davies, Sahni Innovative Practices series 8 years ago to offer a model for our students every year of an innovative approach to architectural practice. Randir is here this evening with his wife Sunila. Please stand, if you two don't mind. Can we all give them a hand of thanks? Lecture series, Randir recognized that contemporary practice is challenging and that schools can help do something about that challenge. Randir himself is a registered architect, but he's also a registered investment advisor. So he practices architecture, but he also practices wealth management, meaning equities-related money management, as well as capital projects-related resource management. On the one hand, that's an obvious career pairing. On the other hand, it's all too rare that architects understand the complex financial implications of the projects that they construct, let alone of the offices that they run. So Randir himself offers up an example of an innovative practice, an interdisciplinary practice where he's deliberately expanded and strengthened the role of the architect. In creating this series, Randir's hope was to showcase such innovative, agile definitions of practice. Each lecture over these 8 years has offered up an innovative example of someone who's forged an alternative, expansive career springboarding from their architectural education, which, as you know, I argue, is one of the most expansive educations you could ever get. And tonight won't be an exception. It's a delight to welcome to Rice Rahul Mehrotra, who's an architect, urbanist, and professor of urban design and planning at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Rahul founded his firm RMA in 1990 in Mumbai and has designed and built projects ranging from exhibition installations like the one entitled Ephemeral Organism at the 2016 Venice Biennale, to exquisite housing projects, house designs, to a software campus, to my all-time favorite, Hathigaon, a housing project or elephant village for 100 elephants and their caretakers. All of you currently designing housing in your studios, just imagine designing your projects for pachyderms as well as humans. I just can't imagine. I'm so jealous. But Rahul doesn't fit the innovative practice model just because his practice spans the disciplines of architecture and urbanism. Yes, he's here tonight because he's a great designer, but also, and I would say mainly, because of his civic engagement. He has successfully lobbied and tirelessly labored for causes ranging from the creation of public spaces, to historic preservation and conservation, to legislation advocating for recycling post-industrial landscapes. He and his firm have also initiated several projects as part of their advocacy outreach in their office, including a campus for Magic Bus, which is an NGO that works with underprivileged children. It's this civic commitment that makes Rahul a model practice for the Llewelyn, Davies, Sahni lecture series, and that for this semester's Here series. Rahul believes that architecture should respond to a place, which for him means that in a context like India, architecture needs to respond to questions of inequity, of history, of climate, and the local availability of materials and technology. As I said in my all-school talk in January, which feels long ago, but it wasn't that far ago, we look to your generation, the generation of students, to take on the economic, environmental, political, and social challenges that we're facing today, not only by trying to turn back, or not by trying to turn back to a past here that could never be recreated, but by working together in new ways, as a potent, productive, and respectful collective to find new possibilities. Rahul Mehrotra offers all of us a great model of what some of those possibilities might include, and I ask you to help me in welcoming him here tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you very much. I'm totally delighted to be here. Thank you to Mr. and Mrs. Sahni for supporting this lecture and for inviting me, and Sarah for this invitation. Lots of old friends. Wonderful to see you all, but really a pleasure to be in Houston. I've never been here, and heard so much about rice, sort of grown up, hearing about it from Peter Rowe, from many others. So it's just a wonderful place to be, and thank you all for being here. So today I'm going to share with you some of what this kind of relationship I have with my city of Mumbai and how it's come to influence me in terms of the architecture and my working as an architect in India, but also how it's come to influence my concerns and engagements that are sort of triangulated, if I may say, between the practice of architecture, urban design, conservation, and interest in landscape architecture. I've organized this talk in really two sections. First, where I'll take a few minutes and share with you what has been central to my imagination as an architect, issues that I continually struggle with, and largely struggle with the idea of how one can articulate those issues to make them productive for us as designers. I think that's really a very central concern for me. And the second part, I'll focus on a series of projects which I want to share with you, very recent projects, some older ones, and try to connect kind of their design logic set in this context and their materiality, of course. And of course, the connections between the two sections I leave to you because some of these are implicit. And I think it's really the instrumentality of design that I want to try to highlight. So the city of Mumbai is sort of where I sort of work and started my practice. I spent a wonderful morning at the MFA here, and I urge you all to go there. And this image, which is an image I took, was influenced very much by Rahul Singh, and the exhibition there on the modernism along the Ganges is a brilliant piece of work. He died a few years ago, and this is a kind of retrospective, and I urge you to see it. But he kind of taught me to see, and that's why I feel very fortunate about this intersection of having his exhibition across the road from the hotel, because he really taught me this sort of way of looking at the city where really architecture wasn't the spectacle of the city, and many festivals and this kind of ephemeral, kinetic landscape really is what comprises the image of the city in many ways. In places like India, and I think in many parts of the world today, equity and social justice are perhaps going to be the most important issues in the coming year. Because besides the disruption that globalization has caused, it is the drive of capital that we all know has been detrimental to the values we have brought to bear on our environment. I've spoken at length about the architecture of what I call impatient capital, where capital itself is very intrinsically impatient, and the architecture it generates is very particular. I think your downtown here was a forerunner in this sort of manifestation of capital, of impatient capital, where it drives us into a vendor-driven product and a kind of autonomous object, which is then architecture. To my mind, it's clear that this free-running capitalism will never help resolve this inherent contradiction about our aspirations to create green buildings, socially inclined environments, and human environments. Because while architects simultaneously pander to this capital and the forms it demands, we also struggle with other questions of equity and social justice. As Wolfgang Streeck has said in his book titled How Capitalism Will Fail, he says, to quote, "Capitalism can no longer turn private vice into public benefit. Its existence as a self-reproducing, sustainable, predictable, and legitimate social order has ended. Capitalism has become more capitalist than good for it." Or, in the words of Karl Marx, who originally said of capitalism to really start with, and to quote Karl Marx, he said, "has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange that it's like a sorcerer who no longer is able to control the power of neither world, whom he has called up by his spell." And so we are in this sort of condition, and of course this advertises the new Trump town. Spatial inequity is critical, I think. As Charles Correa, the Indian architect, wrote, to quote him, "Today the amount of urban space one controls is directly proportionate to one's status or income. It has no connection to actual family size. In fact, poorer people most often have larger families. This space differential, therefore, cannot be justified in human terms, but only economic ones." In Australia, end of quote. In Australia, in urban areas, at least till 1980, something I verified a few months ago in Sydney, every family could have no more than a quarter acre. Australia was locked into spatial equity and equality, and thus clearly a society that detests elitism. But equity is not a quantitative measure. It has a subjective dimension of access, sometimes perceived access, or an illusion of equity perhaps. Plot divisions and the very fabric of a city is a great contributor to this, and thus by extension, architecture. And this is what I believe designers can play a role in determining and defining. And so I think we have to struggle to find ways in which we can make design instrumental again within the context that we work in. Martha Chen, who is a social economist, advocates in the context of economy, and I quote her, "What is needed most fundamentally is a new economic paradigm, a model of hybrid economy that embraces the traditional and the modern, the small scale and the big scale, the informal and the formal. What is needed is an economic model that allows the smallest units and the least powerful workers to operate alongside the largest units and most powerful economic players," end of quote. And this is a project I'll come back to, and this image sort of symbolizes what she's trying to sort of say in her quote, because by extension, I believe that the discussion about, we use the word sustainability, has come down to a chemical or a mechanical fix for any problem perpetuated and driven now by an entire green industry. So we make the dumbest glass box, and then we talk about sealants and more efficient fans, and there's a chemical, and there's a whole green industry that has helped us develop the narrative. And I believe that actually, the roots of sustainable design lay in the stuff that was happening in the 50s and the 60s through the Tropical Institute, that was at Bartlett and other places in London that were doing development projects in Africa and India. They were talking about passive cooling, the work of Jane Drew, Maxwell Fry, and a whole host of people. There's a whole literature around that. Somewhere in the 80s, you had the high-tech architects who ran away with this debate on sustainability because they built these really high-end mechanical-looking objects. I mean, the Pompidou Center came from another genre and impulse, but it inspired a whole lot like that. And then green buildings and sustainability became a mechanical or chemical fix to a problem that we really designed ourselves into. And so, I think the crucial question and questions that are absent and have to do with spatial arrangements need to be brought back to the discussion. How do we make a space a social condenser, an armature to foster and facilitate social connections, not hard thresholds that separate people? So here the human dimension, or at least in my observation, is totally absent in all these discussions, and that, I believe, is really frightening. The second issue, I think, that becomes quite critical is the notion of pluralism and coexistence. Because pluralism of form and its coexistence are inevitable in a democracy, as are collisions between differing forms of urbanism in close adjacencies. Thus, dissipating these polarities and softening thresholds between these disparate forms of urbanism are an essential design challenge. Facilitating the connections and networks between diverse forms is one way to promote this sort of synergetic dependency. The questions, therefore, that come to mind, and this is an image from Mumbai, the city I work in, is can borders be deconstructed and softened, and can boundaries be dissipated spatially? Could this become the basis for a rational discussion about coexistence? Or is the resulting urbanism inherently paradoxical? Is the coexistence of these differing forms of urbanism and their respective states of physical utopia and dystopia inevitable? Can the spatial configuration of how this simultaneity occurs be formally imagined? Or is it inevitable that cities will be molded in a singular image where architecture is the singular, remarkable spectacle of the city? And so I think what I have described so far are a few of what I might call our spheres of concern. These are things we're all concerned with, and we can expand it into climate change and a whole host of things that we articulate beautifully. But how do we make a productive overlap between the spheres of our concern and the spheres of our direct or indirect influence? As architects, we are aware and concerned with many issues, as I said, from the societal to planetary scales and range from poverty to public health to urban violence, climate change. More often than not, our sphere of influence does not empower us to address any of these issues in the tangible manner. Across the design professions, the frustration tied to our attempt to engage with these problems, I think, are palpable. Entire disciplinary practices, I believe, are in the danger of dissipating because they can't move beyond expressing and representing these concerns. Where is that instrumental edge? Most importantly, these narratives, they actually highlight and illuminate the narrow concerns we have of the architect and the architect's territory of operation in the business as usual model of practice. It also sheds light on ways to better understand the site as mediated through and embedded within a larger scale of economic, social, and political processes. Through this broader scope, designers can potentially have a far-reaching, I believe, progressive social impact beyond the immediate site on which our projects sit. Therefore, using the city as the mediator and as the generator of our practice, this sort of pushes us into understanding the meta-narratives that are critical in situating the practice in a broader landscape. To borrow my colleague Neil Brenner's term, the context of the context. So we as architects, very clever and articulate about our context, climate, material. We excavate history sometimes for those of us who are braver to engage with the cultural dimension. But this context, which we understand within the discipline, actually sits in another context, which is the context of globalization, of transitions between socialism and capitalism, in the context of neoliberal policies. As I was saying to someone earlier, in the context in India, for example, where aesthetic modernity arrived and became the tradition in which we were even trained before social modernization arrived at our shore. So a complete disjuncture even in our training in terms of the kind of aesthetics we engage with. So in today's world of globalization, social media, etc., unless we can nestle our context as we understand it in material terms, in its context, which is this broader, fluid, much more complex context, I think we can't nourish our practices adequately to engage with society in its kind of broadest sort of way. And so while we talk about the practice of architecture, it's really the architecture of practice that we don't spend enough time. And what are the models by which we can engage? We sort of tend to engage with very singular models of practice, and we don't see the simultaneous validity of engaging with different modes of operation. That is the limitation of the pedagogical framework in which most of us are trained, but it's also perhaps the complexity we don't want to begin to get engaged with, because in different models of practice, the protocols and processes are completely different. People stumble upon this in their practice. They find another way of doing things. But the challenge for us teachers is, could we begin to program that into the curricula so people can see those different ways of engagement even while you're being sort of trained. And so for us, really books and the production and communicating of architecture became very important, and these are the kinds of books that we sort of produce as part of the practice. Some of them are scholarly, some of them are walking tours, some of them are brochures to sort of fight for a cause in the city or to push for legislation. But I do believe that we can't see this as apart from the practice. This is one of those many models of practice that have to be simultaneously embedded in the regular business as usual practice. And so there's a whole series we've done on Mumbai, which have done different things for the city, like I said, all the way from walking tour to more historic sort of overviews to a book just on the history of the railways in the city, because the railways is so instrumental in a way in the DNA of Mumbai. Now some of this has resulted in things, in action, and so one of these sort of became the document that we use for advocacy. To get legislation through the government in 1995. It was the first legislation on urban conservation in India, so it kind of became instrumental in the process of doing that. And the way I kind of retrospectively look at this is, when we talk about this making and constructing of research, we get involved in advocacy. Actually, our role in producing the instruments of advocacy is also equally important. And so the moment you begin to separate the two, you begin to find many other roles you can play. Because it's not only about advocacy, which is lobbying and getting stuff done, but I think it's very productive for research to also mindfully construct those instruments for advocacy. And that begins to even place research and its communication in a kind of much more nuanced mode, which I think, again, is important for when we try to understand these different models of practice. And this led to a whole district in Mumbai, the historic district, becoming a heritage precinct, and we began to see that actually the legislation wasn't leading to anything because nothing happened on the ground. So we went back and began to redefine districts based on what we thought were the contemporary engines that would drive the process. We created a banking district, we got the bankers organized to affect change. And one of these early ones was an art art district, which is an easy one to do because a lot of art existed there. But this was advocacy on the ground, but also producing these instruments for advocacy, and it led to the preservation of these sub-districts. It also led to many contemporary interventions that we made here as part of the museum, because once we had an imagination of what this district meant for the future, we also could see what the lacunas were in terms of contemporary infrastructure. This is a visitor center for a Grade 1 Prince of Wales museum, which then acts as a threshold for the entrance to the museum. It's contemporary, it's reversible, because it's a Grade 1 precinct. You can dismantle this building in 48 hours, so that another generation might find another expression in a historic district. So part of this is also to set up this sort of dialogue between the new and the old, the contemporary and the historic, but also work within the canons. And this comes from understanding it through the research and the writing of conservation, where reversibility becomes critical, because you don't want to lock a generation into ways that one generation might think of dealing with a historic environment. The other kinds of research that one is interested in is, this is what Sarah alluded to, the Kumbh Mela, which was mapping this mind-blowing sort of phenomena that happens every 12 years in India, where a city for 7 million people is set up on the banks of the river, and 120 million people visit it over 54 days, and an entire city is built. And so this became an interdisciplinary project which was produced as a book, and then became an exhibition at the Venice Biennale. And again, I think ephemeral urbanism as a rubric, the idea was to infect the larger debate about urban planning and about urban design, because we take permanence as a default condition. We have no way in our disciplines to deal with the notion of time in any sophisticated manner. And so the idea of taking this project onto an international forum was to really infect that discussion about urban design in a forum like the Venice Biennale. And it was called Does Permanence Matter? And it was an installation which also looked not only at the Kumbh Mela, but it looked at refugee camps, it looked at military camps, it looked at anything, extraction towns, anything of a settlement over 20 or 30,000 people that we knew had an expiration date. That became the criteria. That is, if you in advance knew what the expiration date is, which we often don't know for architecture, for cities, how do you design something? So that became a way of really challenging the mainstream sort of discourse on, and it was all built in bamboo and printed on cloth, and led to the publication of this book called Ephemeral Urbanism, which is a much more mindfully articulated piece of work to situate it in this broader sort of discussion about urbanism. And recently the Architecture Museum in Munich installed that book and its research as an installation for 6 months in Munich, which was interesting because Germany is dealing with this problem of refugees and the sense of these ephemeral sort of fluxes, so to speak. And so in Germany, it was quite well received with over 70,000 visitors, where we actually printed, because they also have a large Turkish community that builds these beautiful carpets. So we printed on the carpets large-scale sort of maps of these settlements and extraction towns and refugee camps, so people could actually sit there and look at these drawings and feel situated in it. We also created an AutoCAD drawing of Burning Man, for example. The idea was to really produce, we did about 200 cases, but to actually put them in the language of planning discourse, so densities and areas and drawings from which one could calculate circulation areas, so that it becomes embedded within the discourse. So we looked at markets, we looked at military towns, extraction cities, etc. Now this is extended into research that I'm currently involved with, which is looking at what urbanism and what the urban mean in India, which will be a book in a few months. Because in India we have there are many complications, but essentially the thesis of this book is that India is 60% urban for 6 months of the year and 40% urban for 6 months of the year, which means you have 300 million people in flux. And that is a massive number. And so that has to inform planning, it has to inform housing policy, because you need a whole completely different kind of game plan to deal with flux like that and what that means. And it's a really interesting set of questions which come as an extension from the stuff on ephemeral urbanism. But looping back to architecture, we've also been documenting architecture in India. This one is since 1919, since we liberalized. The other book looked at South Asia, which then got converted 3 years ago into an exhibition with the National Gallery of Modern Art, the state of architecture in India. And there are many interesting things that came out of the research. You see that blue line in this graph, which shows the growth of real estate, and it jumps since 1990, after it got organized when we liberalized our economy. What you see in these columns is the schools of architecture. There was two at Independence, and you see them growing. But after our liberalization, you see it skyrockets. In the last 6 years, we added 56% of our schools. We have 460 schools, 428 schools in India. 56% of the schools were built in the last 5 or 6 years. And that's because the parents of children see a huge amount of gated communities, developers building away, and they think, wow, this is the field to be in. But really, the growth of real estate, architecture, the profession, and the growth of the profession is inversely proportionate to the growth of real estate, because when developers do large projects, they hire one architect who houses like 5,000 families versus 200 architects who might do 20 jobs each. So architects in India have no jobs. People can't find internship. There's a real crisis in the profession because there's a completely different reading where actually it's inversely proportionate, not directly proportionate. So the exhibition surfaced many such claims. Of course, I can't go into this. This has been produced as a catalogue. And this year, we just finished, dismantled this a week ago, a second edition, just on the state of housing. Because we felt that's when the intersection of the city could occur. And this was an exhibition that was broken into 2 or 3 parts, a timeline that mapped housing policy from 1947. We documented 80 housing types from 1947, we call those chronotopes, and a film, a 40-minute film that tells the whole sort of story. But anyway, I just sort of wanted to share this with you because I think for me, all of this is integral to the practice. These are all the different practices within the practice, because I think for me, working in India, one realized that the architecture of practice had to be completely different if one had to not be disengaged with the context and actually be more instrumental in making change. And all of these, the protocols and processes are different. And really, it's 90% of architects are building the 1%, which I call the architecture of indulgence. This is what is celebrated in the press. And I know for the state of architecture, we decided we would eliminate this from the exhibition. The press was livid. Our colleagues were all livid because 90% of the folks got thrown out of the exhibition because most of them are building boutique homes or weekend houses, stuff like that. The other end of the spectrum is the stuff of advocacy, NGOs, self-initiative, which has become very celebrated. I mean, this whole idea of social architecture, it's like bizarre. I mean, architecture is intrinsically social. How did that become a category, and when did that happen, and why did that happen? But that's become the other end of the spectrum, which is the alternate practices. People are celebrating craftsmanship. I mean, this is supposed to be integral to architecture. NGOs, people, the barefoot architect model, so to speak. The mainstream is where the change can occur. Institutions, corporates, developers, faith-based practices, which is huge patronage in India. Faith-based practices, it's like 90% of the big projects are faith-based practices. You can call them religious. I think they're faith-based. They're not religion per se. So how do you nuance this? And in retrospect with our practice, we said the client is not a singular entity. Actually, you've got to deconstruct what the client means. And for me, the client there are 3 parts. One is the operational client. The other is the patrons and the users. Now, when we do a weekend house, actually we're lucky, or when we do a house for a family, we're lucky that this collapses into one entity and it's the client. The patron, the operational client, and the user is often the same. I mean, it's always the same person. In many other projects, this gets completely broken. Sometimes the user has nothing to do with the patron. The patron doesn't even know who the user is because the government is patronizing it. So unless you see it in this nuanced way, it's very hard to see what might be the architecture of practice, or what is the model of practice with which you would engage with. So really, it's patrons, operational clients, and users. They compose the broader client as we understand it, and often they don't, and they get separated. And so, like practices, and I'm going to now show you 6 or 7 projects quickly. This is weekend homes. We all do that. That's how you survive. Mumbai, this area, lots of weekends homes are made. And of course, this also becomes experimental. It's interesting. This is a house. They're often located near villages. The question is, how do you not build a mansion? Because often people build these big autonomous objects. And we were asked by a client, actually, he's a young doctor who discovered drug-resistant TB, and he wanted a mansion. He showed me pictures of mansions. Like you have in Houston, houses are becoming very big. They're becoming these mansions. Everyone wants mansions. And we had to work through him, and we basically convinced him to disaggregate it, which means we said it should be an idea that even a middle-class person can build incrementally. So we took the house and we broke it into a living and dining and kitchen space, which was a house in itself, a lab pool. This was a zone of indulgence with a guest room and his study, and then the 3 bedrooms for the family, so it could become a large family room if the kids were together. If they had guests, they could separate it with screens and make 3 rooms, but it's disaggregated, which means it implies a kind of incrementalism. So it's also an experiment. It does 2 things. One, it dematerializes in terms of massing when it sits next to a village. So it doesn't create a polarization through built form because it gets disaggregated, but also it becomes an experiment that a middle-class person or a young family might build one of these units as they can afford it, and they can add on over time. And so that's what it sort of feels like. In that landscape, it's very sort of low-key, and it has this kind of disaggregated feeling. Just the openings are highlighted in copper, the insides are just cement floors. It's very bare actually with a series of these courtyards. Also there are good things about architecture, light, how it gets defragmented. Also the zone of indulgence, how it can be more discreet, where you interlock visually with the green, but the gardener working there is not seeing people sunbathe on decks, because otherwise this zone of indulgence is actually an instrument for polarizing the locality. In fact, it sits in. And as you go through the house, there are these layers. These are the 3 bedrooms. The screens come down. They're kind of subtly tucked away. So if they want privacy, if they have guests, it collects the water. It opens out to the outside. Very simple sort of material, so it's low-key. There's no art. It's just these colored glass that have the light changing through it, and a series of courtyards that punctuate it. When we move into these larger projects, because historic preservation is very much part of our practice, this is the Chowmala Palace in Hyderabad, which we restored. It's an important 12-acre palace property. It used to be 54 acres, and everything you see around it is encroachments illegally. So it was a very complicated project to stabilize the central space, to make a public space. And here it was, so the patron was the princess, the Nizam's wife, who wanted to reclaim this palace but give it to the city. The users were citizens there who would use it as a museum, as a public space. And the operational clients were her lawyers, who we had to deal with because they were untangling the whole thing. So here, no one had the client, the patron and the client, of course, were in connection, but the users were people we had to get a pulse on. So then as an architect, if you break and unpack these sort of constructions, you then know what pulses you get from whom. So you're not taking them the directive only from the patron, because they have no idea about the users. Then you have to make an effort to connect with the users. And that's why deconstructing this for different projects tells you what the mode is by which you engage with who you want to work with. So that red area is all the area that was encroached. That's how we found the palace. It was about measure drawings. It was about all those good basic things. We made about 120 measure drawings which are digitized, so there's a beautiful portfolio. Then also records of all the defects, the cracks, the damp. A column like that takes 3 months to make. It's in pure lime, or lime with, of course, sand and other mixtures, but it takes 3 months because it's really a post and beam structure in granite. And it takes 3 months to do this in 3 layers, which take a month each. A rough layer over the granite, then molding it, and then giving it the final kind of finishes. So you begin to deal with time and craftsmanship, and this is a continuous craft in India because we weren't decimated by the world wars, where a lot of this sort of went out of the windows. And so it's a whole different rhythm. It's also a different mode of engagement because this is oral traditions. We're not making drawings for them to do this. We're talking a lot to them. We're sitting around with them. We're mapping it in different ways. And this is the finished product. That entire ceiling is new. It was cast afresh because it had completely collapsed. So it's you have to simultaneously begin to not reject an aesthetic that you might not subscribe to, but actually engage it on its own terms with all the protocols that lead to its construction. And I think this differentiation is critical if one has to engage with these different models of practice. And then, of course, interventions. This is glass, which you can't see because it's very minimally touching the old fabric. This is a Jainana, where these beautiful saris were restored. So I restored as a very simple museum because there was very little money, no dehumidification, no lighting. It's just sort of based on the assets we had. Next, a more recent project, which had its own complexities. And this is the School of Architecture in Ahmedabad, which was designed originally by Doshi, who won the Pritzker Prize. I studied here, I was an alum, and had the misfortune of them selecting me to be the architect for this. And it was going to be the first non-Doshi building on the site. So politically, it was like being thrown into the lion's den. One survived, it's over, we photographed it, and I'm out of there. Anyway, I go back and doing other things. Here, it was interesting. The patrons were the Ahmedabad Education Society. They were the guys who got Louis Kahn, Cobb, they were patrons of architecture, they were the mill owners in the city, very industrious, very honorable folks, very wonderful folks, because they have a great mission to make Ahmedabad this sort of modern place. The clients were all my architecture colleagues, which were the faculty there, and everyone, his dog, uncle, everyone had an opinion of what the building should be. So that was like really complicated. To do something in the School of Architecture, as we all know, is very complicated. And the users were, of course, the students. And so here, again, one had to work with these completely different groups, which meant a lot of consulting, lots of public presentations at every stage. This is the campus. And they gave me a site. I had no choice on where to place the building. This is a new cafeteria we just completed actually a few days ago. And this is sort of the buildings Doshi had done. It was added piecemeal, so it didn't have that much coherence, but we had to add something here. And they gave me a brief where they said, you're going to build here, it's going to be a 6-story building, and this is the brief. And I said, this is impossible. I'm going to be fried alive by the profession and by Doshi if I do a 6-story building. And of course, that was the program, and we had no choice. But what we came up with is an idea where we said, well, just let's do 3-story. We won't go a centimeter above Doshi's buildings. We'll relate to every parameter there. For me, it was like making an intervention in a historic, modernist historic district. And so we were very careful about that, but we went 3 floors below the ground. And for the Ahmedabad climate, that's ideal because it gets to 50 degrees centigrade there. And that the step wells and things, building underground and keeping the building cool is a traditional practice. And so it was very difficult, but we went underground. And of course, there were a series of models and discussions, and it kind of evolved to this finally, an outer skin, an inner box with the carrels and things. So it's like 3 buildings within each other. They're nestled in each other. This is one shell. This is another building. And within that, there is a building which are where the book stacks are. And they all have a different logic in terms of floor-to-ceiling heights, which respond to different things. The outer skin responds to Doshi's buildings around in terms of proportion and scale. The inner shell relates to the reading rooms and all of that. And the stacks are just 8 feet high. It's like walking into a large walk-in wardrobe with books. And so that's and the light goes, the natural light goes all the way down to the bottom. That was the biggest challenge. And it goes down to the bottom through a series of these courtyards where you can modulate this facade, and the light bounces down there, and I'll show you images of that. And these are different sections of it. That's the built version. It's a concrete base, and what you have are these movable louvers, and there's one stick here to operate that entire panel. So it's very easy to do, so it can be set at different readings depending on the facade, the light conditions, and who's sort of within it. And that's how it sort of relates roughly to the campus. And that's the threshold you cross to come into it. It's like a large courtyard, and the building sits within it. A series of bridges actually connect the building, and then you begin to have a completely different refraction in terms of light during the night. The ground floor is meant for students, their jewelry spaces, their workshop areas, which students can organize in their own way. Here you have a more formal exhibition, and that's the Doshi building. This is exactly on axis. So at each of these apertures are continually framing the Doshi buildings, which are very important historically in the contemporary architectural discourse of India. And so they are framed very carefully as different vignettes through the building. And then with changing light at twilight, it of course changes and refracts and reflects, and depending again on how the louvers are changed. So that was on the ground level. Now when you start going down here, there's a whole different kind of logic. There are carrels that are like these boxes that you see, which are kind of cantilevered out into this space. And then the upper level are the reading rooms, but we're going to go down here first, which you see has its own logic in terms of floor heights as you walk through it. So these are the carrels, and you see the book stacks within. these are the book stacks, you can, and the carols and people who want to speak or have discussion groups. There's going to be furniture out here. This is going to be for exhibitions. That's all beginning to happen. You just step out so you don't disturb the rest of the library. And of course, comfortable space. You can see this person sleeping. But from every level, you begin to you see simultaneously 2 or 3 levels. And so as you walk into the stacks, it's like I said, walking into a large walk-in wardrobe. And here you see 1, 2, 3, and this one, the four levels simultaneously. So sectionally, your vistas are always highly expanded through the building. And the bottom is the quietest area for reading, and a series of internal stairs that take you down here. And here the light changes dramatically. This is the bottom level, and as you open the louvers, you can adjust the light depending on the time of the day, the season, and all of that. And that's the more finished sort of version with little conference rooms. The structure, the services are all integrated in the stack, so the structure is just these 3 concrete portals that support it. So there are no other columns or beams at that whole level. And the retaining walls and this become a composite kind of structure. So it's very minimal without any false ceilings. It's what you see. And then as you go up, it's a completely different quality of light. It's sort of better lit. Light can be controlled with these louvers. These are the sort of reading rooms and areas for sort of, yeah. And these are areas which will also have conference tables. So these are meeting rooms outside, so people are doing working sort of discussions. They don't disturb the rest of the building. And the louvers can be adjusted, as you see here. There's a catwalk with a harness detail, so you can wear a harness. The students are going to actually operate the building. So this is a manual that we've developed for the operation of the louvers. And I'm just showing you 2 pages from it, but it basically gives you the season, gives you the month in 2 languages. It tells you at what setting the louvers would be ideal for that month, on that facade, for that particular panel. And they're going to teach a course. The course on climate is going to use the building as a case. So they're going to measure temperature and all of that. So it becomes a working thing. And the campus is really brick and concrete. And the idea here was also to use materials that are used today, drywall and plywood and steel and glass, but to kind of configure it in ways that were sensible and that were climatically correct. And so the building is also a demonstration towards that end. Has lots of niches along the base which get occupied for students, so they kind of feel a kind of blur between the inside and the outside. And that's really the materiality of the building, except for the wood on the louvers. It's just a combination of these materials. So when we go into corporate buildings, which is the next 2 that I'm going to show you, the patron, client and users, it's really the patron and the client that often become one. The users are people in the office. So again, it's going beyond the regular obvious client. And this was a building in Hyderabad, which is for a corporation called KMC. That's Mario Borta's building for the Tatas. These are all high-tech buildings. Generally, this is clad in brick, but the rest are just glass boxes. And this is all filled in now. This was a Google image from 10 years ago. And this was for an infrastructure company that does highways and freeways. They're high-tech. That's like the NASA control room. They have a camera on every piece of equipment, and they sit here and they monitor how much time people take on breaks and things. And they wanted a high-tech building. They wanted a global building, and that was the brief. And we started looking at things, and we found that so these are buildings that are glass boxes. This is where Mercedes-Benz has their showroom, and everyone in Hyderabad is building these glass boxes. Hyderabad also went through a break in the state from, they broke the state into 2, and so there were lots of riots. And these were great buildings to stone because it was reacting to global capital. They were glass buildings. And so when the vendors who sold you the glass facades, they actually gave you a choice of what color nets you wanted. So they did all the details for the fishing nets so that people couldn't destroy the glass that they gave you for the facade. And it made me think that in a context, and this was no understanding of the context, because people were yet building these glass blocks, even though people were stoning in, and then the vendors were giving you fishing nets, and they gave you the choice. If you were using blue reflective glass, you could do blue fishing nets or white fishing nets, and it was so crazy. So we were inspired by something quite different, which was a little hut in Jaipur, which is used as a water cooler. The government and a social organization set up about 100 of these. That guy works for them. When he is ready for business, he puts out a kettle, and you can go and drink water. No plastic cups, nothing. You just put your hand there, you drink the water, you clean your hands, You wink at the guy just to say thanks and you go away. Every once in a while he comes out and he wets the building. So he keeps it humid. It's made out of tanks. So it becomes an air conditioner because through evaporative cooling, basic principle of passive cooling, it stays very cool. It's also very beautiful as a gesture. It's very simple. And then the earthen pots also keep the water cool through evaporative cooling because they are porous in a sense. And it's just this one shiny object. It's so humane. It was absolutely moving. And we were doing some work in Jaipur where we saw this. And we said, how do you take these principles and make a building out of it? So this is what sort of inspired us. And for that we made a green building. Now this is not a green wall where you stick green on the wall, which is what green walls have become. But this is a performative facade which has a misting system inherently embedded in it. It's a spec building, but this facade allows the air going through it, which is going through the humidified facade, to stay clean and cool. And this is a 5-story garden in a sense. And every facade is different. It's grown on an aluminium trellis. And basically, depending on the direction, you can grow what you think would grow with sun or without sun. And so you get these variations. We grew them in a nursery, tested them, and then developed a whole rationale for it. And again, talking about impatient capital, the clients wanted this building in 12 months. We said, we'll give you the building in 12 months, but give us 2 years to grow the facade. And they agreed. So the cows were bought in, they made it sank, the vastu, the prayers, all that happened. They started using the building while we were yet making the facade. And then this is when the trellis was ready. It's a cast aluminium trellis, which is very rough because we use recycled alloys of aluminium to make the So we used an old contractor. He set up a business just for this. It took 2 years to do. His business became viable. And the trade-off was making only one mold because the mold was very expensive. That's what took us 2 years. If we had made 5 molds, it would be very expensive. These are the recycled bars, and that's where the misting system goes. It's a curvilinear kind of trellis. And then there are very small panels, which are all hand-made, so to speak. 2 people can carry it, and when enough are ready, there are women who work there because it's very light. This is the anodizing process. They are put in a yard, and then when they're enough to fill a small truck, they were taken to site, and then 2 people just assembled it. And when it was ready, you had the creepers growing on it. This is the misting system. The plants don't need the water. It's a hydroponic tray, so it's drip irrigation. But this just is atmospheric, but also keeps the building cool by humidifying it. And there are different zones depending on the plants, and you can set it differently. We were going to computerize this whole thing, but of course the economy fell and now it's manually operated. But it becomes a thing people call their friends, people who work in the company call their friends to enjoy this when they know it's going to go on and off at 12 o'clock in the afternoon or at lunchtime. The water is collected, and of course the facades are different, the flowers grow on it, people bribe the gardeners to take the flowers, to pluck them, and you have this kind of feeling of wetness. The gardeners are omnipresent, they actually make the patterns around it, and that's the ornament of the building in a very simple way. You see, depending on the light, the ornament on the surface, and that's what the world outside looks like, which then you don't want to really look at. But it's interesting because it becomes a woolly monster. You trim it, give it a haircut, it goes back to that. It's an ever-changing facade based on a very simple sort of principle. It sits on a podium where the parking goes under it. And what you see in glass are the conference rooms which have uninterrupted views. The podium is also a social space, and it changes depending on the season, the zone, etc. And it's quite sort of lush. And it's interesting because it also, sectionally, it is a series of courtyards which extract the hot air. This is the tendering department that needed privacy, so that's the only one that doesn't open up to other volumes, but it's essentially 2 voids that sit in this volume with interconnection. So the scale also changes. And we're now mapping it. We never bothered to map it, but friends have urged us to map it, so we're seeing what the result is. Now that's a building like the walkie-talkie building in London. They have a LEED certificate. We never got a LEED certificate because we didn't seal our windows, we didn't have elaborate air conditioning. Now India has changed that and we have a local code. But the green building code for green buildings, LEED, didn't give us. But that building has a LEED certificate, and exactly like the walkie-talkie, that's offensive in the public realm. But that's what I meant by it's a green industry that's sort of encouraging a chemical or mechanical fix to problematic solutions such as this one. That's what the waiting area looks like. The green is sort of omnipresent. Now I come back to this image, and it's an image Carlos Chen, who was an intern from Panama City. He took this image, and when I saw it, suddenly it told me a whole story. You know, the gardeners are the poorest and the lowest paid employees in the corporation. They make no money. They are poor gardeners. But by getting access to the corporation, this we didn't design intentionally, but this is one of the after effects. They actually access any part of the building without anyone asking them. And they look into the faces, into the eyes of their bosses, who then acknowledge them. There's an empathy that gets automatically created. And this woman wouldn't be wearing a sari like that if she was just in the garden where she knew the boss would go by in tinted glass, BMWs, and have no acknowledgement for them. And a friend of mine, Sanjay Prakash, who's a well-known energy expert, he said to me, these are true green jobs. He said, because the identity of this building now depends on its poorest employees, so they get empowered in a kind of reversal in terms of how the architecture then manifests itself. And so it's interesting that how one can create these spaces. This was totally transparent and honest, it was an accident, but it's making one think about how do we surface people who are at the lowest rungs of these buildings, but actually often are integral to the identity of the building. So they're really the heroes of the building. You see here the CEO type of guy working away after reading his Financial Times, but the gardeners can hang around and transgress. Now there are blinds there that he or she can put down, but often they don't, because then there is a different kind of, there's an empathetic kind of relationship. And now, if you go to their blog, you have people who make friends with the gardeners, they bribe the gardeners to make bouquets because they want to take it home to a wife's to their anniversary, or they catch a butterfly for children in school. So they've become very much part of the corporation. I mean, from my perspective, by default, we didn't set that out as an agenda, but it's important to roll that back into our learning. And that's how it sort of sits in its compound where the other buildings is. So we sort of extended this learning in a completely different way. We were lucky to be invited to do a building in Basel on the Rhine, on the Novartis campus, and we did one of the first buildings on the Rhine River, which was an interesting site to be sort of given. And here, it's an interesting campus for those of you who know it. Vittorio Lampugnani did a very strict master plan, and the poor guy was left with a triangular site, so they gave that one to Frank Gehry. And the rest were sort of given very strict bylaws and heights and things like that. And so it was a very constrained set of requirements, and we came up with that, which was a garden, and we put the offices here, the labs there, and areas for the scientists there, and some public spaces on the ground. It was interesting coming from Mumbai. I don't know where you're trying to subvert everything, but we found in our analysis that all the architects, and may I say very well-known architects on the campus, have all built accepting this diagram, which is two large cores with air conditioning, the elevators, the shafts, the staircases, and then organizing the labs in there and the offices of the perimeter. And every building there only focused on the facade, because this diagram no one challenged. We found this to be terribly problematic, both if we were going to look at a long-term view. So we disaggregated them. And we said, look, the air conditioning ducts could be separate, and that allows us to make a zone where the scientists can sit quietly. The lab, this gives us a huge open space. It was a nightmare because in Switzerland, there are 20 consultants to think about how to put a light bulb into the socket, and very complicated. My friend Vito knows this very well. And so it was a nightmare getting this through, but once we got this through, it opened up all sorts of possibilities in terms of plan. The other thing that I found problematic was everyone accepted a 5-meter ceiling height because of the lab and extruded it. And we kind of analyzed that by saying that, look, the offices only need 2.4 meters, 8 feet. So if we used up more FAR here, we could carve out a whole courtyard, which would become a social space in the heart of the building, like a greenhouse, that would heat and cool the building too. That also was difficult, but once we got that through, it again opened up a lot of possibilities. So we came up with this diagram with a large courtyard, visitors areas here where you can look at the Rhine, the labs, these are the ducts that you see, and then a garden veranda where the scientists could go and read. And we worked with Gunther Wopp, who was a Zurich-based landscape architect, who developed the landscape within these courtyards. He also developed a facade with 28 species that would register almost every month through the year, including the winter. And so you've got a facade with this sort of ever-changing green. That's the Rhine side facade. Of course, these are all automated, so they drop when the sun comes out, and these large double-height verandas from where you can enjoy the Rhine. And this is the facade, quite in contrast to Marquis, which was like white glass, and we had this, which was, you know, the Basel sandstone. I mean, the Basel sand mixed in the concrete with the green kind of facade to contextualize it. And just plans that sort of show you how the principle of opening up this large space by moving these ducts to the side gave us immense possibilities in terms of organizing the space, the circulation. People of the RIS worked with us on video installations as part of the artwork, and these are sort of very warm colors that people can walk through in the winter, psychologically warming yourself, but they were inspired by what the scientists see in their microscopes. But on a typical floor, suddenly that gave you the flexibility of having gardens, open offices, labs, verandas for research, and much more flexibility, which is what it looks like. So the office is open to the garden. These are different meeting rooms, which are in decks, all opening out into the garden. So a lot of transparency, but it also breaks this threshold between the scientists and the administrators, which is otherwise a really hard threshold, because there's a very distinct hierarchy, snobbish hierarchy that exists. But this creates a transparency where you kind of have these public spaces that people mingle in. And these are labs designed by Toshiko Mori. She did the furniture for the labs. And these are all the breakout spaces that again make what I'm calling these soft thresholds, where people intermingle. You have lunch, but it's outside the lab, but they're yet transparent. The garden is right there. The garden itself is very lush, but it has spaces you can sit in and recluse yourself from everything around it. It has a screen where you can actually have PowerPoint presentations, and you can have meetings all sitting lost in this sort of garden. And there you see the labs through it, and this transparency to the Rhine. And then from the upper levels, as this was growing, this wasn't yet fully grown, but it's a series of decks and things that take you right through it. Now I'm going to change to the last two projects, which I think root us much more in a place like India. It also tells us about the challenges that architects have to face in places like this. This is a map that actually shows you the poverty line, people below the poverty line in India. And you know, except for Kerala, Goa, Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh is disastrous. And that's the landscape you're really working on. And what does this sort of, what does this mean? And I'm going to actually, and here, you know, sometimes the client doesn't even exist. So there is no patronage, or the patronage might be a remote NGO or the Bill Gates Foundation sitting in California. The users are people you can actually not even connect with. The clients become the public works department, or it becomes a kind of entity that you can't even make a bridge with. And so they are disparate folks that you have to put together in terms of the pulse and the reading. And I want to read something from someone called Rahul Mehrotra. And this really moved me because it really tells you the problem beautifully stated. And Rahul Mehrotra, who is now the Vice Chancellor of Ashoka University, where it was at the Center of Research Policy, he says, and to quote him, he said, in a society driven by deep inequality, there's not even the minimal basis for mutual concern. Where social distance makes human beings almost a different species in each other's eyes, why would you expect anything else? Why would a contractor care if one of his construction workers used his hands rather than a brush to apply a dangerous chemical? The more inequality there is, it is harder to imagine what it's like to be in someone else's shoes. It has to be admitted that even the most well-meaning and sensitive find it hard to imagine what the suffocation, darkness, and sheer physical suffering of being at the bottom of a social hierarchy might really be. The very thing you would expect to instigate questions of social justice make it actually hard to even raise them. End of quote. And so it's a very hard situation, because you do come from an elitist perspective. You come with the training of a professional. You come from a upper middle class sort of benefit. And how do you, I mean, are they just gestures, or can you actually relate to them? And these next two projects is something we have really struggled with. So here there is a complete, I mean, this doesn't exist. The first one had to do with sanitation. And you know, this is Davies. I mean, sanitation is a massive problem. It's one of the biggest missions of the government today is sanitation. I took this image accidentally. I took this image, not accidentally. I took this image, I didn't realize I'd taken it. When I went home and I downloaded my computer, I was moved to tears when I saw this image. This boy, totally intact, look at the white socks. He's jumped out of his slum house in Dharavi and he's going to school. You know, he's defecated in the open. He has not had access to a toilet, but look how intact he is. It's like really moving to think that a whole generation doesn't even have basic sanitation, but look how intact they are. And so open defecation is one of the problems in a city like Mumbai. And the statistics are mind-boggling. We've been mapping it. I mean, look at that map out there. And you would think Africa, underdeveloped places. Look at India is the world's highest open defecation, by far. That's why the government has made it its central mission to solve this sort of problem. Let's look at Mumbai. In Mumbai, the UN Development Report says there's one toilet for 1,440 people. One toilet for the SPARC, the NGO we worked with, says 1:800. I don't know why they're being good to the government. The Bombay Municipal Corporation says there's 1 to 150. They've completely distorted. They just divided it by 10. The target ratio of the Bombay Municipal Corporation is one toilet for 50 people. That's 6 families, which means you're going to have a lottery every morning to decide who's going to use that toilet. Maybe 2 people out of the 50 might use it rushing to work or going to school. I mean, for us as a society it's shameful that this is an issue. And what is the role that design can play? Our Prime Minister has made a statement where he wants to, by 2019, have a toilet in every household. I mean, it's laudable that he's even made a mission like that. I mean, I totally am respect for that. But this is where, as designers, we have to be critical and see, is this possible? Of course it's not possible. Could you imagine getting a toilet for every house in that condition? It's a completely impossible thing. And therefore, we have to, as designers, think in terms of transitions. We are stuck with absolute solutions, the magic bullet, to deliver housing by 2020, to deliver a toilet in every house. How do you design for transitions? Because transitions are critical to making transformations. And the design of transitions is critical. India has, because of Bush Jr., India and Manmohan Singh embraced the nuclear energy program. Why did we do that? Because from fossil fuels, for us to go to self-sufficiency, to alternate energy, it's impossible. Our whole economy will collapse. So we went to nuclear. That's a transition we have made. Now we might get stuck in nuclear. That's a political decision. But we have to go nuclear to get to renewables. Otherwise, so transitions sometimes take you in completely other directions. And I think in planning, in urban design, in architecture, the design of transitions, and that's why the question, and this is how it loops back to the thing on ephemeral urbanism, does permanence matter? Is permanence become too much of a default condition for us as designers? How do we grapple with transitions? And so, of course, public toilets and community toilets are the transition before you can solve the problem of slums and open up more land and create affordable housing. And this is what the government does for community toilets, and of course, no one uses it. So we got engaged in this through an NGO to test what designers might be able to do, and we came up with this model where we kind of made it a 1-2-story thing, which is what they had, with the women and children on top, because they are the most sort of susceptible to abuse when these toilets are used, because women at night can't go there, children get abused in these places. It's a huge problem, and the men are here. And then we wrapped it with a green facade, and this was being idealistic because we'd done that project with a green facade. I said it would cool it, you won't have to have windows that break. I also idealized it. I said, all Indians pray in the morning, putting a flower at the foot of the deity. Imagine if they went to the toilet and plucked a flower to use for prayer. It would completely dissolve this sort of psychological barrier. Crazy architect thinking about this. And then what we did, and these are the two moves that I think made it an important shift. One is we put the caretaker's house on top of the toilet. The caretaker is usually the lowest caste. And suddenly he or she got the penthouse, which was a political decision, and I think we made a mistake, because even though we say the caste system doesn't exist, the underlying tensions are huge. So we put the caretaker there. And then I'd done a house for an investment banker, a lovely weekend home, and I went to meet him one evening, and he poured himself a scotch, and as he poured himself a scotch, I told him about the statistics on public defecation and open defecation, and I could see him getting teary-eyed, and then I asked him for a grant to put solar panels on top of the toilet, and he gave it to me for 8 toilets, so we had the money. The guilt was just perfectly timed, and so we got solar panels, and that took the toilet off the grid, which allowed women and children to use it at night, because otherwise the contractors who run this don't put on the electricity just to save money. And so the solar panels were put. And we designed one, it went up to the foundation stage, and the government stopped it. And I went to meet the municipality, they said, what you've designed is an iconic building. I said, like, what do you mean? They said, you're creating a community space, this slum, we've actually negotiated with a developer, we're going to remove it, we're going to put buildings, we're going to house them in an apartment there. If you get the community to organize, we're never going to be able to do that, so we're not going to allow the toilet. So we tried another one, the same thing happened. So then I told Sheila Patel, who was from this NGO, I said, let's go to a remote site where the roads are very bad and the municipal guys won't even go to check, and let's build it. So here this was an architect being impatient, like impatient capitalism, and it was a mistake. But we built it. It got built. You see the solar panels. It's in this kind of remote slum. The children begin to use it. It really was very successful. It was used a lot for studying. That's public housing that people haven't moved into for 15 years because they've chosen to live in slums. That also opens up a whole problem about the housing paradigms, solar panels. It was very successful. It was breezy. It gave you an overview of the settlement. People loved it. The plants began to grow a little bit. They started using it. And then I went back 6 months later, and it had been abandoned. And of course, Beckett came to mind, ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. Because this had become a adda, as they call it, a hangout space for men. There's a television to watch cricket matches. This sack is full of old monk rum bottles that were used in the night to drink. And the government was building one more because it turned out the politician was running it. It was a complicated story. I'm happy to share it with you. But I was saying to Sarah earlier that it would be wonderful in a school of architecture to do a conference on failure, call 20 top architects and ask them to present one project that failed completely. I would present this one and tell you the whole story. But I think failure, we don't know how to discuss failure. And we fail often. So we then entered a competition with the Bill Gates Foundation sponsored competition where we took this further, we made it reversible in steel, we embedded it much more in the community, we made it a sanitation hub where water could be sold, sachets of soap could be sold, we suggested you put a laundromat in it so the grey water could be recycled from the WC. I mean, we did a whole thing. But it was an ideas competition, we won the first prize. I went to the NGO in Delhi who was charged by implementing it. And he very sheepishly said to me, we couldn't wait, the Gates Foundation competition took too so long, so we had money for $500, we appointed a contractor, we're following the old system. So we failed again. And I think we tried, of course, placed it opposite the temple, just again in a provocative way. So, I mean, in these projects, these are wicked problems, failure, I mean, that's why young people don't get involved in it, because they're sensible, they don't want to fail right when they start, but I think for us to fail once you establish a practice is important. I'll end with this project, where, these were the users, and this was what Sarah was talking about. It is called Hathi Gaon, which means elephant village. It's a project, a low-cost housing project, which I say low-cost is economically weaker sections. These guys earn 5,000 rupees a month, which is less than $100. They get a little tip, so they make maybe $120 a month, which is even low by Indian standards. The elephants, you see how they look like they're in poor health, because they are tropical beings, and here they're in a desert climate outside Jaipur, so they can't take the heat, they have no water. And so the government did a competition because animal rights activists sort of lobbied through the chief minister to do that. They came here through the Mughals and the Rajputs for pomp and ceremony, and they got appropriated, as you see here, tourists sitting up there, they became part of tourism, it became an exotic experience, but they were very misused, and they go rogue. It's never advertised, but 3 years ago they went rogue at the Amber Palace. They killed 3 European tourists because they can't take the heat. They're not supposed to be in a desert climate. And so this is what they do. This is how the government had housed them, like cow garages. The elephants were here, the Mahouts lived there. The Mahouts had to all move down here because the Mahout and the elephant have a very complex relationship. They sing to the elephant. They have to control this beast, and they actually bond with the elephant. So their proximity in terms of spatial arrangement is very, very important. And so of course this failed completely. So the government, we won this competition, the government gave us this land which had been quarried by sand contractors. So essentially it was pits, it was like wasteland, and we had to build there. And so we said that it's not an architectural problem. I think that's why we won the competition. We said it's a problem of landscape. Unless we can collect enough water, there's no point having a housing complex for elephants. So we treated it as a landscape project, creating micro dams to create wetness. That was the site as we got it. Google image told us, Google map image told us that there were water streams in the little rain they have. So we structured the project in a way to use those streams and to capture the water, and then in the interstitial or the waste space actually put the housing. And so that's the final site plan. It basically is these housing units, these water bodies. This is a museum visitor center which hasn't yet been built. There's a guest house now that's been built there. These were buildings that existed on site, and we just renovated them to make it a school for the Mahmoud's sort of children. This is the housing as it's distributed. This is how we got the site in 2007, and in 3 years, that's the same hill that you see. It got transformed by just holding the water there. We were lucky. The government actually abandoned the project because the Congress government appointed us, and then in a year they fell. And when the new government comes, they never want to be part of an old government's project. So actually, I was very frustrated. But in retrospect, it actually helped us because when the site lay empty for 3 years, the water collected, the vegetation was uninterrupted, and it regenerated itself. And now in 2017, in 7 years, that's the same hill that you see. It's actually a forest in some parts just because the water is held. Of course, we also paid attention to the architecture. It's very small, 30 square meter units with a house for the elephant. And what we did was basically, instead of doing row houses, which is what the government stipulated, we created the courtyard paradigm. So you had a courtyard for every house, and 3 houses shared a courtyard. So eventually, the space they got was like a mansion, because it's the open to sky spaces that they really use, and how it could grow incrementally, and all of that. And then how we could use these canopies to store the hay for the elephant, which would also act as insulation. So it was very frugal in terms of what materials we could use, but we tried to modulate those materials in whatever. That's what a site visit sort of looked like, because elephants can't sleep on flat ground. They need a slight slope, otherwise they can't get up. That's why they sleep on berms. And so for different sizes of elephants, we had to actually experiment and do mock-ups. And so, we don't have a book on our work, but it's also going to be called small, medium, large, and extra large. This is going to be the cover image. This is going to be the cover image. So that's what it looks like built. And then, the government built a little bit of it, and then again, it collapsed. So we were left with nothing. But life began to occupy it. These are elephants, the children of the Mahmoud, who can also, pet the elephants, but they have to bond with the elephants as much. This is a projection of what it might feel like. That's a Mahmoud coming home. You can see the slope in the land. Different people look at their clusters differently. Some people have grown lawns, others have left it quite bare. In some cases, they grow flowers. So while the elite in Jaipur have to get tankers of water because there's a water shortage there, this poorest community, which is largely Muslim, in fact, it's 100% Muslim, they have more water than they can use. So now they sell flowers, they have lawns, they have all those ideals of the middle class happening here just because the water has been trapped. And of course, each of these have evolved differently as the trees grow. They become like communities. Life corrodes housing, and the goats have arrived. You can see the elephants, the trees are growing, the dish antennas have arrived. And the project, actually around this stage, about 7 years ago, was abandoned by the government as it shifted. What the elephants sort of really do is they take tourists up there. Sorry, that's not work. So this is what they do in terrible conditions. They get painted, and that discolors their trunks and their faces. And because they don't have water to clean it. And now, of course, that has changed. That's why you see a discoloring of that. They walk to work. They used to walk 10 miles to work every day. Now, of course, it's much closer. But the main thing the water did was, besides their health, I didn't realize this when we were doing it, but it was critical to the bonding between the mammoth and the elephant, because this is when we had just planted the trees. This is all in 2006-07. And this is the elephant coming home. And at that point, the government had stopped patronizing it. So we were just mapping it ourselves, just to keep on top of it. But the process of bathing between the elephant and the mahout is what creates the bonding. And this is completely critical for this whole operation to even exist, besides for the health of the elephant. And so the mahouts play with the elephants, they bathe them, they are very comforted with the water because of the heat in Jaipur, and they're very, I think the elephants themselves are very sort of grateful for this sort of luxury. And many parts of the site have sort of blossomed on their own just because the water was caught. We also had to make these pavilions because elephants, you know, they can't be isolated for too long. They have to hang out with their buddies, and they're very social animals. So for 3 hours, 4 hours a day, you've got to hang them out together. And as the teenage kids of these elephant owners began to become teenagers and social media, they saw this as an opportunity. So they started a company called Elephantastic. You can go to their website, you can book a bath with the elephant for 500 rupees, you can feed the elephant for 100 rupees. So there's a whole economy that is developed. We didn't design it, but by just making these social spaces, the armature was there for these kids to take it over. And today, for a generation, you are what your Facebook page is, right? So people go photograph themselves in the elephant, that's the guy with this t-shirt, which is the company. And this has now become a business and a little economy that has developed there. So this is really the mapping of the project from 2006 to the present. And you see, this is the BJP government which actually appointed us. I'm sorry, when they went out of power, the Congress didn't bother. So this is a mapping of the political parties, and here the BJP has come back to power. What you see in grey are the different user clients, which means it was first the PWD, then it was the Tourism Department, then it was the Amber Development Corporation, then it was the Zoo Authority, then it was the Forest Department. We had changing clients like every few years, as you can see the grey changing. At this point, everyone switched off, except us. What you see in red is our firm. We kept consistently through, and we kept going on and off just to map it and things. And in 2016, I wrote a letter to the Chief Minister telling her about the benefits of the project. And that year, we got a gold medal from the University of Ferrara for the best sustainable project of the year. Glenn Murcutt was the chair of the jury. So it was big news, and that helped her wake up. And she wrote me a letter and said, let's start. And she created an agency, which was a composite agency with many, many people. And we got totally involved. And in this last year, 90% of the project has been sort of finished. And I'll just show you some glimpses of what we managed in the last 9 months. Once the government woke up. There's yet much more to be done. Who will do it, I don't know, but after 10 or 12 years, I'm exhausted, and someone else has to sort of, I think, take it over. But this is really the story of the project. And this is how, when they abandoned it, people were yet using it. And this happened a few weeks ago, where we've created these pens. This is going to be a green wall, and these will be areas elephants can roam free. They also have water facilities in these pavilions, so that these communities of elephants, or 15 elephants, can be together. So after this monsoon, it will grow. We've created an entrance gateway, an information center where people and tourists can buy tickets and take a guided tour. You can see the trees have grown. We've created a whole set of infrastructure, small swales and things which will capture the water. About 5,000 trees were planted 3 months ago. The monsoon, when it starts in June, this whole thing will green. These grasses will completely populate this. We came up with an idea of doing a small guest house, which could be used for conservators, NGOs, people who come for research, which has just got finished. It's very low-key. It's a courtyard with an entrance portal in red sandstone, and just 4 rooms and a dining facility, and a veranda from very unobtrusively people can watch and observe the elephants. That's just a study model, and this got built a few months ago. And here you see it, that's the entrance portal. It's very low-key, just the local materials. That's the internal courtyard. And then these are the wives of the mahouts who are being trained by someone from the tourism department, and they actually clean, cook, and run the place, so it also helps their economy. These are the convicts of the Jaipur jail, and we involved them in doing the furniture. So all this furniture was made by these guys who are part of the same community, and that's what the guest house looks like. We try to make it a little more sophisticated, peacocks, but also using just very, very simple materials. And now, as people get ownership of it in their own mad way, because of the water, as they see birds and things, because Rajasthan has a great tradition, they're painting and decorating and doing all sorts of things. And you can see hundreds of trees that have been planted. This will be a forest in a matter of a year or two. And some of the parts where the drainage is the best, have actually become like a forest. And this is a projection. Once we have these smaller check dams and swales and you can create a wetness, you'll get an ambience like this, I hope. The restored buildings we've made into a school by adding this pergola, where now the children of the marbles actually go to school, and there's a whole generation that sort of is emerging there. So essentially this project was about creating an armature for life in a sense. We prioritize the water and the environment. And so I just want to summarize by saying that for me, working in Mumbai, and that's why I use that as part of the title, is about negotiating what I would call global flows, so that they don't just erase and remake landscapes, but rather occupy local fissures to create, I think, fascinating hybrid conditions and sometimes startling adjacencies. The design challenge in this condition depends on how you make these disparate worlds blur. Can the threshold between them be spatially softened? As a practitioner of social access and its clear relationship to the articulation of spatial arrangements becomes, for me, a critical aspect of the design, as we've tried to do in some of these projects. This is not about the city of the rich or the poor or the regular models of the formal and informal or other binaries that are used to explain cities in South Asia, Central America, Asia, Africa. Rather, it's about what I call a kinetic space, where these descriptive concepts collapse into a singular entity, and where meanings are ever shifting and blurred. The question for architects, conservationists, urban designers, planners then becomes, can we design for this space of blur? Can we design with a divided mind? And more importantly, how might we be inspired by the design intelligence of this condition to act and intervene as designers and activists in our own localities? Can we use design to construct soft thresholds that facilitate porosity both socially and spatially? Across our projects, the approach has been to use place to inspire our work in the context of the crazy democracy, the mutinous democracy of India, the site of our operation. Furthermore, we've attempted to, I believe, integrate spatial arrangements as well as building elements to meet contemporary sensibilities as well as building a kind of vocabulary that might be relevant. The attempt is to combine resources while juxtaposing conventional craftsmanship with industrial materials, traditional architectural arrangements with contemporary spatial planning. In short, to give expression to the multiple worlds, the pluralism and duality that so vividly, I believe, characterize India as well as the South Asian landscape. The highly pluralistic environment of Indian landscapes requires planning, attitudes, and design mechanisms, I believe, that continually negotiate between differences in architecture as a sole instrument for placemaking, and the temporality that creates the conditions for habitation and celebration. It must include the state and market, the empowered and the poor, rather than allowing one entity to prevail and remake the place in its own image. And that's why unpacking what the nature of the client is becomes very critical, because then you know who all you are representing. Otherwise, you become gun for hire if you see your client as a singular entity and you get that nourishment for your project and your spatial imagination from one set of agendas rather than multiple agendas. And I think this is what makes working in Mumbai and the landscape of India unique and challenging. Here, extreme distances exist in very close proximity, in your face, and not as distant, abstract notions. A pluralistic society, I believe, is one that not only accepts differences but also goes beyond to understand and even be influenced by difference in a productive way. That is, to see the simultaneous validity of differences. Because once the architect and planner sees these various differences as being simultaneously valid, the challenge then is how do you go beyond these polarized binaries through the making of architecture, soft thresholds and spaces that are visually porous, plural in spirit and expression, and most critically encompassing of the context. And I think this is truly the aspiration, at least for our practice. We are aware that many of the conditions I've described are emblematic of the issues and crises we are facing in many parts of the globe, the contemporary world that we all collectively occupy. Things I've spoken to you about today, I'm sure you could interpret them in different ways for the American context, for the African, the Latin American context. And so understanding the crisis and articulating it in terms that are useful for us as designers is the crucial first step. That is, how do we make those instruments for advocacy before we even begin to engage with that advocacy? So how do we translate these concerns in ways that they can actually become part of our sphere of influence? And so the crisis is important to recognize, because as Paul Romer of the World Bank said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Thank you very much.
interact through the glass or whatever it is. But did their lifestyle change? Did they get more money when they allowed to eat in the corporate dining room, or the line was still there? You are some kind
Right.
of
So it's interesting. It's a very interesting question. And both these projects we designed at the same time. In the case of the Hyderabad project, we designed it to articulate and challenge the formal condition of how sustainability looked at, what does the LEED certificate mean, and it was really about cooling the building. What happened to the gardeners was, like I said, a default thing. We never designed for that, but then we began to observe that it allowed that to happen. They are much more respected. I don't know, I haven't done the research on whether their lives have changed. I know they're getting more money because the clients are very young people who we became friends and we got to know them, and they heard me speak about it. They became very aware of the fact that the facade really depends on the gardeners. And when you go there now, they're all wearing uniforms with their name tags, so they become part of the culture of it. Now, I think they dine in the cafeteria. I'm not sure how much more their salaries are. I'm not also sure how their housing conditions have improved. But I know that the engagement between the owners and the executives of the company has dramatically changed with the gardeners.
they got recognized.
They got recognized. Now, the after effects of that, I don't know, and I think now that you brought it up, I will find out. But I think that's what happened because we came to it as an architectural project where we were looking at other. In the case of the Hathingam, we started the project with saying we have to transform the lives of the elephants and the people. We can't just provide a lot of water for the elephants and the elephants become healthy and the people get into terrible conditions. So there we were very mindful of creating a mobility in terms of the lifestyle, space. We subverted in ways what the government stipulated, but without changing the area, by configuring it around courtyards, giving them more space and things like that.
I was one of the white happened and they go to the same line and I thought that what they go to.
Yeah.
They
Yeah. And it's been very complicated. I mean, this is a lecture in itself. There are many things. Right now, the thinking among animal activists and things is that even this is a form of captivity. So that they're even doing this, and so the animal rights activists have been, and we've been part of those discussions. Is to actually free them back, take them all out to the jungle and leave them somewhere. But that's not going to happen. And so it became a very difficult question for us when the project got revived, whether we stay still part of the project or subscribe to what the animal activists were doing. And we actually managed to create a bridge with the animal activists, and that guest house served as a nice place to have lunch with them and talk in a civil way rather than in a confrontational way. To say that let's think about this in terms of transitions, that you have, 800 people dependent on their livelihoods on these elephants. So for a start, let them be looked after more humanly, and that's where those large pens were made with water drinking and all of that. And then the animal activists agreed to that because they had not seen that transition as a possibility. They saw it, badly treated elephants, put them in the jungle. And then how do you oppose 800 people who are up in arms because their livelihoods go? So it was, I think we were very deliberate about convincing them that let's use this as a transition. Let's say for 10 years, we make the transition. So you don't employ any new elephants. If elephants are retired, take them into the jungle, try and get them. That's why the women have been employed in the guest house. So if their incomes go up as mahouts, they might think of other things. The younger ones are now savvier. So in a generation, they won't want to look after elephants, which means maybe in 10 or 15 years, you can actually release them back in the jungle. So we think in terms of transitions. That's why I'm more and more, as a practitioner, feel that we are very biased intrinsically by absolute solutions, end condition thinking. Sorry, there's one question someone had and then last. Someone had that. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Under the leanest conditions that would exist in this context, and comparing those to the lean conditions that we might find here in Houston, which might be a very tight pro forma or limited structural systems, have you developed a system of processes or a rule of engagement that you tease out a way to access that greater context?
The short answer is no. The longer answer, of course, one is thinking about that, and doing these kinds of presentations is a good way. I haven't written about our work, which I now hope to feel more confident about doing. Maybe in the process, one will try to address some of these questions, but I haven't honestly articulated in any communicable
capitalism is, in a sense, a destroyer. And this is, I mean, it's frightening to say this because I get listening. If I speak about this loudly, because this is so systematic here that it can't turn anything. It's only one way. But it seems to me that there's therefore an enormous opportunity to create an innovative process that might then be brought back into the capitalist society in a sense the way we brought the greed into capitalist society. Because that's in a sense an invasion of the non-capitalist into the capitalist.
Absolutely.
Could be very
Absolutely, and that's why Martha Chen's quote, which I used in the beginning, is actually also questioning that. I was talking to Sarah earlier with some students, and Eve Blau, who you also know, and I was saying how Eve, her work in East Europe, which has been very helpful for me to think about what's happening in India vis-a-vis capitalism. She talks about, she says these are simultaneous transitions, that in America now it's 100 years of capitalism or more, it's entrenched as we're describing it, but in a lot of East Europe and in India especially, these are simultaneous. We will take decades to transition out of socialism and decades to translation, and this is an incredibly important period to get that kind of that condition you're describing right. And I think architecture can play a big role. And even in this Hathigam project that I showed you, it's interesting that the Vasundhara Raja, who was some of the Indians who know her, she was the chief who bought the idea of actually finishing the project when I presented it to her as a project which is emblematic of sustainability and all this kind of stuff. And she got all her departments to buy into it, which is actually transformative because now they see those as possible ways of doing it. Otherwise, they were blindly looking at paradigms which are not relevant to the place. And so I see a lot of hope if one can intervene in this space before we are locked into a paradigm which will be not reversible. So I know that's very well articulated.
In a way, a city like Houston is an alphabet city without centers.
Yes.
Not an alphabet. When all of these discrete buildings begin to cooperate with each other, you can build a town that is absolutely essential because ultimately it was a very special landscape. The woods vary all the time, the woods, all of that has that potential. That's why it used to be so promising in my view. It's just that it needs to realize that each of those enterprises are not alone, that there is a reason to do together.
Thank you very much.